All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 19, American Empire. So, in this chapter, we have a chance to focus on American foreign policy as opposed to focusing on the history of what was going on in the United States domestically. And so, if you're not familiar with those terms, it might be helpful to find them. Domestic pretty much means in the US, specifically in the border. So everything related to the Gilded Age, the conquest of the West, Reconstruction, that would have been like domestic events. And then there is the question of foreign policy, and foreign policy is what's going on outside of the US or beyond the border, so outside the US. So in this chapter here, chapter 19, we're going to have a chance to focus more so on this question of foreign policy. So it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the stuff in this chapter is going on simultaneously as what we talked about in the earlier chapters. As the United States is going through the Gilded Age, that's what's happening in the US. This is kind of what's happening outside the United States. So in the introduction, we are introduced to this term, which is going to be very helpful for us in understanding what is going on in this period, because now we're not just talking about what's going on in the US, but we really need to understand what's going on in the world. And broadly speaking, the time period after the Civil War falls under the broader time period known as imperialism. And imperialism is, we'll call it a time period when industrial nations we could just say dominated the entire globe. And there weren't that many of the nations that fall into this category of industrial. It may have been between 10 and 15 countries exerted so much power and influence during this period. Essentially, you could say that they took over the world. And this time period of imperialism falls roughly probably about the year 1800 to 1914. And we can tie this back a little bit to what we learned about the Gilded Age, and that was how much of a benefit technology was. And so, for the nations that had industrial technology, namely the steam engine, but later on things like steel and oil and electricity, those nations had such a significant advantage over nations that did not have those technologies, that they just exerted their dominance over the rest of the globe. And so the United States doesn't really participate in imperialism until after the Civil War, 1865, when the United States finally has kind of the ability to focus more so on global affairs. Now, when we talk about imperialism, we usually refer to kind of two different kinds of imperialism. On the one hand, we have what we might refer to as direct imperialism, and that is simply when one powerful nation takes over quite literally another one, right? Displaces the government and installs their own government. But there's also forms of indirect. And this would be, for example, not simply the outright takeover of certain countries, but stronger industrial nations being able to really force other nations to do what they please, right? So this might include something just like economics. So the United States forcing a country to follow some sort of trade plan that benefits the United States, or forcing a country to allow American businesses in. So it can come in different forms. It can be political, it could be economic, it could even be cultural in some respects. But during this period, a very small number of countries exerted their dominance over the rest of the world, the United States being one of them. And so we're presented this political cartoon here that references American imperialism. It was created in 1899. You have at the center of it Uncle Sam, who is acting sort of as the teacher. And what you have in the background is his effort to essentially dominate other nations around the world. And these children sitting in the front row, they're the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. These would be territories the United States would seek to incorporate into its empire. In the background, you can see the kind of kids that have already been quote unquote, kind of like taught the American way. California, Texas, these are areas that the United States expanded over through manifest destiny. So a lot of things that relate to American imperialism are actually true of what we learned last chapter, and that was the Americans had already kind of used imperialism in their own backyard in terms of the West and Native Americans. There are a lot of similarities. And in fact, one of the things this chapter will mention is that imperialism is, in some ways, a continuation of manifest destiny. You can find a Native American here in the back too to kind of represent that to a certain degree as well. One important thing to note is that oftentimes when imperialism is depicted, oftentimes the industrial nation is always portrayed as the adult. And the adult is, the idea behind the adult is that they are grown up and that they can take care of themselves. And very importantly, the nations that come under the thumb of industrial nations, they're always portrayed as kids or babies or children. And the idea is that they are too little to take care of themselves. It's a way to justify imperialism. If you portray other countries as not being able to take care of themselves, then it requires countries like the United States to come in and quote unquote take care of them. And that was oftentimes used as a justification to go out and conquer other nations. So that's essentially what imperialism is. The United States is not unique. In fact, compared to the other imperial nations, the United States is probably smaller scale, sort of on the smaller scale side. But that is definitely not to say that the Americans didn't acquire an empire of their own. They certainly did in this period. Um, On to section 2, patterns of intervention. So, what did American dominance around the world look like? Well, one of the major motivating factors for imperialism is economic. It's about resources and markets. The resources, this can we can tie this back to an earlier chapter on the West. This could be things like minerals, could be later on things like oil, iron, steel, right? These things are all kind of valuable resources that the United States might look for beyond their borders. We might also add one here, actually, sugar. So if you think about certain crops that are not well suited for the American climate, so something like sugar, there's not too many parts of the United States where you actually can grow sugar. It's not, warm enough or sunny enough or whatever it is. So seeking out certain territories or areas that can grow sugar, we could think of that as a natural resource. But there's also a flip side to this economics, and that is valuable markets. And a market is essentially somewhere where you can sell things. So a place to sell goods. So it wasn't just only about looking for resources, right? Accumulating physical things, but it's also in order to look for places to sell goods. And perhaps the most sought after market in all of the world at this time was the market in China. This was a big, populated nation with a lucrative market, right? You want to sell stuff in China, right? Yeah. However, by the time the United States had already gotten to exert some of its influence overseas, China had already been dominated by a lot of outside powers who had forced the nation to sign unequal treaties, allowing them to sell goods there. Nations that had quote unquote oops, spheres of influence in China already included countries like Britain, France, and et cetera, et cetera. There are more that we could potentially name here. So, when the United States started emerging overseas and trying to get a foothold in China, the fact that a lot of nations had kind of already carved it up was actually somewhat of a problem for the United States. And so the United States took maybe a different approach, we might say. And that was they instituted what was known as the open door policy. And this was a policy which permitted all nations, there's going to be, well, all nations to do business in China. So this could work to the American benefit, right? Instead of having China carved up into spheres, which pretty much was the case at the time, there was like a British zone, a French zone, a German zone, a Japanese zone. The Americans are saying, hey, look, why don't we all just do business anywhere in China that we want? And that could benefit us all equally. And that accomplished essentially two things. One was that it could prevent war between the imperial nations, right? The British zone or the British wouldn't have to fight the French over each other's zones. If they could just share, then they would prevent war. But maybe more importantly, this would let the US in, right? What do you do when kind of other countries have already divided something up amongst themselves and the United States is kind of out? If the United States says, look, let's all just do business. And again, the idea behind the open door policy is that let's pretend that China's doors are open for everyone and anyone can come in and do business. And so, this was a way to kind of get the United States a foot in the door, so to speak. Now, namely, a very important actor or nation that was not present or addressed with the open door policy was actually China itself. And that's how imperialism often worked. And in fact, not only because of the open door policy, but because really of decades of interference from countries like the British and the French. The British had been in China ever since the 1840s. The Chinese really came to resent foreign occupation. In Chinese history, this is sometimes referred to as kind of the century of humiliation, when outside powers effectively went to war with China and dominated them economically for, not quite 100 years, but pretty close. And so the Chinese weren't going to simply sit back and allow for foreigners to come in and reap all the economic benefits. And in the year 1900, the Chinese revolted. This was a Chinese Box Rebellion. A Chinese rebellion really against, this would be indirect because the Chinese government stayed in place, indirect foreign imperialism. The Chinese were kind of sick and tired of outsiders reaping the benefits. They rose up in a rebellion against the outside powers. And what is maybe more kind of interesting about the Boxer Rebellion is the response. And it was a response that was not just taken up by each country individually, but was actually taken up as sort of a concentrated effort. And so the response was imperial nations, including the United States, will say united together and put down the rebellion. And so the Boxer Rebellion was crushed, and outside powers, the United States included, continued to reap economic benefits in China for the next couple of decades or so, without any interference. So one thing that made imperialism possible was the fact that there were many times in which the industrial imperial nations worked together, quite frankly, in order to put down rebellion. So the lucrative Chinese markets could be enjoyed by the United States and by American businesses, much like they could be enjoyed by other nations around the world. So that was one example, and China or the Chinese markets is maybe one of the better examples of how imperialism could be motivated by economics. Another example is in the case of resources, and your textbook provides kind of an interesting example for a natural resource that was acquired overseas, and it used the Guano Island Act of 1856 to do this. The Guano Islands, or as I understand it, guano, it's either a bird or what they leave behind. The Guano Islands, these were islands with bird, just for the proper term, we'll say bird droppings, but bird poop. Islands with bird droppings that could be used for fertilizer. And so the United States Congress in 1856 passed this law that allowed Americans to essentially take over these islands for the purposes of harvesting the fertilizer that could potentially be used. Kind of an important point about this act was the fact that when these territories were acquired, they didn't belong necessarily to any kind of state or federal government. These were what they called quote unquote unincorporated territories, meaning they really didn't apply like kind of directly under any specific government, um, but would sort of set a precedent for how territory could be acquired. I mean, there'll be some cases, for example, where lands acquired by the United States don't kind of fit nicely or neatly into any specific governmental apparatus. So, natural resources, markets to sell people to, these were reasons why the United States might look beyond their borders. Another example, or another thing that might cause Americans to intervene overseas, is to protect American investments, or at the very least, American interests. And the example that we're going to look to here is Mexico. But some areas that also included a lot of American investments were just Latin America more broadly. Latin America refers to Central and South America. This would have been an indirect kind of imperialism, if you want to describe it that way. Latin American nations maintained their independence. It's not like the United States took over those countries, but the United States did a lot of business in those nations, and a lot of that business was worth a lot of money. And when when the infrastructure or money or profits or anything else was threatened, that could cause the United States to act. And so the example that we have here is in the case of Mexico. In Mexico in 1910, Mexico went through a revolution. And this was a revolution that, caused some political instability. It caused political and really, quite frankly, economic instability. Right? There are different factions that are fighting for power. There's warfare going on the ground. And so, for American investments in Mexico, this revolution is not good news for American business. So, we might say cause political and economic instability, which we'll say threatened US investments. So, in one example of American intervention, the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, I believe, was the president, sent in American forces to kind of secure American interest. This occurred in the port city of Veracruz, the Veracruz operation. So, we'll say about Veracruz, US troops were sent in to, we'll say, secure the city of Veracruz. And so, what could happen in instances of indirect imperialism were examples of direct imperialism. So, sending US troops into a sovereign nation like Mexico would constitute certainly as a violation of their sovereignty. But the point is that the United States was more than willing to do that time and time again during this era in order to kind of secure American investments. Another example is the case of Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa, he was what we call him, a raider, a popular general in Mexico. But we'll say about Pancho Villa, he led, say, Mexican raids on U.S. towns around 1916. So he'd cross the border from Mexico with his followers into U.S. towns, generally raid them in order to take whatever he potentially could. And as a response to this, the United States sent the army into Mexico to get Pancho Villa. So once again, whether you choose U.S. troops going into Veracruz or U.S. troops crossing the border into Mexico to go try and arrest Pancho Villa, these are both examples of how the United States could violate the sovereignty of of nations in Latin America. Um, we've got sort of a flavor of the economic motives. We got a little bit of the flavor for how um, economics and politics could be linked, right? How, politics might affect American economic interests. But imperialism was not only motivated by the economics. In fact, a lot of ways in which Americans appeared in certain countries around the world was actually inspired by culture, namely Christian missionaries. So we might say the drive to convert sent Americans overseas, right, to other nations. So oftentimes the first Americans to appear in some of these countries were Christian missionaries looking to spread the gospel. One good example of this is in the case of Hawaii, where the first missionaries, we might say missionaries, arrived in 20. But Hawaii wasn't only sought after for Christian converts. It turned out that Hawaii has a geography that is quite nice for sugar growing. And so, by the 1830s to 40s, U.S. sugar growers a little bit more, sir, 1830s to 1840s, U.S. sugar growers sought Hawaiian land. So there was also an economic motive. And to be quite honest, kind of the way that imperialism worked a lot of times was there were multiple motives at once. I mean, a place like Hawaii could be sought after for missionary activity or religious converts. It could also be sought after for natural resources. It could also be sought after for markets. I mean, there were a lot of kind of competing motives, often overlapping, right, with each other. Another good example for Hawaii specifically is the geography in the Pacific. I mean, Hawaii is not perfectly located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but if you're going to sail from the United States to China, let's say, and you need somewhere to stop, Hawaii is almost perfectly in the middle. And so it makes sense geographically why the United States might want to have these islands because, again, it could be like a refueling station or you could drop off cargo. There's reasons to do that. Similarly, some of the first Americans to arrive in the Middle East were there on sort of a missionary mission, or at least missionary mission, there to spread Christianity, or at the very least, looking to establish colleges. So, for example, some of the first churches or colleges, excuse me, established in the Middle East. One was created in Istanbul in 1863. This is back then it would have been the Ottoman Empire, which is today the modern day country of Turkey. One established in Beirut. This is Lebanon, which is just north of Israel. and Cairo, which is located in Egypt. And so missionary activity or colleges established by Americans in these sorts of countries could also be kind of a version of America exercising influence beyond their borders. Section 3, 1898. And 1898 becomes an important year in America's quest for an empire, mainly because this is the year that the Spanish American War occurred, 1898. And this was a war that lasted less than 1 year, right? All of it happened entirely in the year 1808. And it ends up giving the United States quite a bit of territorial acquisition. So the Spanish American War is a war, I mean, like kind of the title suggests, a war between Spain and the United States. And really, the big difference between these two nations, or one of the big differences that will factor a lot into the outcome, is that the United States was emerging as one of those industrial nations, with kind of the important technology that might be needed to win wars and acquire territories. Spain was not so industrial. And when non industrial nations did actually go to war with industrial nations, it was the nations that had, the steel navy, the combustion engine, that had factories that could produce, could often win. And that eventually is what gives the United States the upper hand in this conflict. Now, one of the questions ought to be, how did this war break out? And in fact, a lot of this conflict occurred over Cuba. So, Cuba, if you're not familiar, it's an island located not too far off the coast of Florida. So, it's close in proximity to the United States. But Cuba had been a Spanish possession. And every couple of decades or so, there would be a revolution or political instability in Cuba that might threaten American interests in the same way that political stability in Mexico threatened American interests. In fact, Cuba would very much fit into the category of Latin America. So we might say a Spanish possession that Cubans, we'll say, would occasionally revolt. Oftentimes revolting against Spanish influence, hoping to throw the Spanish out. Now, one of the ways in which many Americans interpreted these revolutions was not necessarily a threat to American business, although that is kind of always looming in the background. I mean, we might just kind of bracket here, US investments, because there was US investments in Cuba that could potentially be threatened by the political instability. But the way that it was covered in the American press and the way that many Americans came to understand the situation in Cuba between the Cubans and the Spanish is that they viewed the Cubans as being like Americans revolting against a tyrannical European crown. And that was, instead of the English colonists revolting against the British, here were Cubans revolting against the Spanish. And Americans saw Cubans as like being like them. And so Americans and newspapers came to support what was called Cuba Libre. This was popular support to kick Spain out of Cuba, right? Or, I mean, Cuba Libre, you can just think of it for Cuban liberty, right? Or liberation. So a lot of Americans actually started pressuring members of Congress in order to do something about the situation in Cuba. They actually wanted the Americans to intervene. The president at the time, President William McKinley, who had won the election of 1896 and defeated the populists, he was actually quite hesitant for American intervention. You might just say, sort of a side note here, President McKinley was see what's a good word? Was hesitant on U.S. intervention. Hesitant. Interestingly enough, McKinley was the last American president to have served in the Civil War, and so you might say about McKinley is that he understood the cost of war, maybe a little bit more so than some of his younger counterparts, namely Teddy Roosevelt, who was very eager for war. But he still wanted to protect U.S. investments, and so he sent an American ship, the USS Maine, down to Cuba in order to kind of look after potentially what the revolt could do to American investments in the area. But everything changed when the USS Maine exploded in, I believe it was Havana Harbor. This was an American. I don't know exactly what classification of a ship this was, but let's just make it simple. Call it a battleship. I don't know if it technically was a battleship or a cruiser or destroyer or whatever else you call that, but an American battleship that exploded in Cuba, resulting in, what was it, 266. Now, when the USS Maine exploded, Americans who were already very eager for Cuban liberation used it as a way to justify American intervention. Immediately, we might say, we'll say many blamed Spain. The belief was by the broad American public that Spain had destroyed this or blew up this ship. This idea of Spanish action resulting in the destruction of the Maine and 266 Americans who were killed was mostly circulated through the press using a very specific type of journalism called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is a term that's going to pop up here in this chapter on the chapter of American imperialism, but will also pop up in other chapters, perhaps the one on the progressive movement. And yellow journalism is a style of journalism that really exaggerates the truth, exaggerates the truth to tell a good story, right? So one thing that a yellow journalist might do is they might describe an event like the USS Maine exploding in very graphic and detailed terms. And in many cases, journalists who engaged in this type of journalism, they used to have a saying, and that was, don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. Tell the good story first, because the better story that you tell, it means that more people are inclined to buy those newspapers. So stories like the explosion of the USS Maine could suffer from yellow journalism. Yellow journalism also liked to talk about the wartime atrocities that were committed by Spain in Cuba. They would nickname, or the newspapers would nickname, Spanish generals with things such as like the Butcher, for example. So the idea that Cuba needed to be liberated from Spanish rule in Cuba got a lot of traction from the journalists of the time. And after the USS Maine exploded, after a number of Americans died, William McKinley, who had kind of hoped to sort of keep a lid on things, he was really unable to kind of keep that lid on anymore. And in 1898, the United States declared war. U.S. declared war on Spain. And the blowing up of the Maine was probably the most significant contributing factor to that. Now, many Americans believe the war against Spain was over Cuba. I mean, that's kind of the way that Americans understood it. However, The war against Spain allowed the United States to attack not just Cuba, but all Spanish possessions, including territories they had in Asia. George Dewey, who was an American admiral, so we might just say about Dewey, U.S. admiral, went, use a little bit stronger word here, attacked Spanish forces in Manila, and Manila is in the Philippines. And the Philippines was a Spanish colony. So when the war broke out with Spain, it was not just sending troops to Cuba, which the United States certainly did, but it was also ordering the United States Navy to go to the Philippines. And in fact, following the Spanish-American War, the Philippines is actually going to serve as quite sort of the point of controversy. The political cartoon that we saw up here is sort of alluding to that. It said the Philippines are the only stepping stone, referring to China. So earlier we talked about the Chinese market. Well, the Philippines, at least according to this political cartoon, could serve as a valuable gateway into China. And that's why some advocated that the United States not only liberate the Cubans from Spanish rule, but maybe also use the war to acquire territories like the Philippines, which might serve as an economic benefit to the U.S. So the United States was successful in their attack in Manila and quickly defeated Spanish forces. It didn't really take much time. Very similarly, in Cuba, the United States was also successful in their battles. Probably one of the more well-known or recognizable instances of fighting was that by the future president Theodore Roosevelt, who established the Rough Riders. This was a voluntary cavalry unit that fought in Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt, up until this time, he had served, I believe, as Secretary of the Navy. He resigned his position and created the Rough Riders because he was from that generation that missed out on the Civil War. He was born after that. And especially for that generation, there had been no kind of big conflict for them to like prove themselves. And so Theodore Roosevelt was actually quite eager to go and fight in Cuba, having kind of missed out, of course, the way that people kind of romanticize the Civil War, but missed out on the earlier conflict. The United States military was highly successful in all arenas. They defeated the Spanish in the Philippines. They defeated the Spanish in Cuba. In fact, I believe more Americans died of disease than actually of combat in this. And a peace treaty was already being negotiated. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 ended the Spanish-American War. And it was a clear and decisive U.S. victory. Amongst the terms of the peace was territorial acquisition. Now, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were all annexed. Annexed means added by the United States, meaning the United States would have control of it. Now, you might be noticing kind of an important territory that is missing from this equation, and that, of course, is the territory of Cuba, which, again, remember, many Americans believed that the Spanish-American War was a war to liberate Cuba, and so there were members of Congress that wanted to make sure that this was not simply just an excuse to annex Cuban territory. These other territories like Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, they were annexed by the U.S. as a result of this conflict, but that was never one of the explicit aims at the beginning, at least not one that was known by a broad swath of the population. So Cuba did become independent. However, in many ways, the United States still maintained kind of indirect control of Cuba. right? Maybe we'll just say Cuba, independent, but indirect U.S. control. Indirect U.S. control. So that was the outcome. As Americans called it, it was the Splendid Little War, meaning that the war was short, it was low casualties or low death rate, U.S. victory, right? This was, as many seemed, kind of what the United States really just needed. They needed just a quick war that they won that didn't kill a lot of people and gave the United States really important territorial acquisitions, namely the Philippines, which is like really one of the first direct acquisitions of the United States that was a significant way beyond their borders, right? Now the United States was kind of emerging or competing with the big boys when it came to imperialism across the world. This cartoon here would have been a pro-imperialist cartoon showing you the before and after of what the United States did in these areas. So we see the Philippines here being weighed down by Spanish oppression, Hawaii, which we'll talk about in a moment, Puerto Rico and Cuba, Spanish yoke, and then Panama, which we'll talk about in a different section. That was the before the United States took all their areas. And then you see the afterwards, and it seems like everyone is thriving. And so this is kind of part of a larger justification that many had for imperialism, and that was the idea that the United States was doing good by exerting its influence. So this would have been a pro-imperialist point of view. Now, during the war, the United States did take advantage of the political situation in order to annex Hawaii. Hawaii was annexed, and annex just means to be added by the U.S. in 1898. In fact, its strategic location in the Pacific Ocean was kind of a perfect place for the United States to defend its west coast, which they afterwards they built, of course, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and could serve as a sort of a gateway to the Philippines, where they were fighting the Spanish. It should also be noted that earlier, U.S. sugar and fruit businesses had essentially ended the Hawaiian monarchy. That's to say that Hawaii did have a governing system, but by the time of the 1890s, much of that government was dominated by American sugar and fruit businesses who could elect various members to, like, I don't know if they exactly called it a parliament, but to the Hawaiian government. And when the Hawaiian queen was thwarting efforts by American businesses, essentially sugar and the fruit businesses just arrested the queen and essentially took the government. This happened probably about 6 or 7 years before the United States finally decided to annex it, but we might say that it did provide a little bit of political instability that perhaps allowed it for annexation. So Hawaii became a U.S. territory only later, I think 1959. It became a state, right? So statehood was still a little bit a ways away. But what was maybe the most kind of important consequence from the Spanish-American War was what to do with the Philippine Islands, because this became a big controversy. Many Americans kind of said, wait a minute, I thought that this war was all about liberating Cuba. I didn't think that this war was about territorial acquisition. And in fact, there were a number of Americans who actually opposed the idea that the United States ought to go out and acquire something like the Philippine Islands. And so the question was, well, what do you do with it? Some suggested that maybe the Philippine Islands should have some sort of independence. Right, that was one question, and others suggested that it should just be a U.S. could essentially replace Spain. Right, Spain had controlled the islands before. The United States had defeated Spain. Now the United States ought to take over the islands much in the same way that the Spanish had controlled them before. The Filipinos themselves had hoped to have some semblance of independence. They declared their independence, established the government, and elected the first president of the Philippine Islands, Emilio Aguinaldo. So we'll call him the first Philippine president. And really, he hoped for the Philippines, to be independent. And in fact, when the Americans first arrived in the Philippines, there was actually great hope that they were there to overthrow the Spanish and liberate them, much in the same way that Cuba was liberated. But what they found is that the United States and ultimately those in charge had decided that the Philippines would be much better if the United States simply replaced Spain. And so the United States would take over the Philippines as a colony in a very direct way, right? Displacing the Filipino government, not acknowledging it, and establishing an American government over the Philippines. And what ensued was a conflict known as the Philippine American War. This was, we might say, the violent effort to kick the U.S. out of the Philippines. And this was a different type of war. This was longer than the Spanish American War. It was bloodier than the Spanish American War. It was a war that involved guerrilla style tactics. It was a war of insurgency. It was a war of occupation. It was the Philippine American War was less like conventional wars, like, the War of 1812, the Spanish American War. Those were wars in which army fought army. The Philippine American War was a war in which the United States was occupying foreign territory, and those who were fighting against the United States could be dressed up in military uniforms or could portray themselves as civilians. So it was a little bit more like maybe the war in Vietnam or the war in Afghanistan, in which the United States is dealing with an insurgency and not kind of like a standard conventional army. But eventually, the United States did gain the upper hand, and the Philippines did become a colony. Right, so the Philippine, you might say, American Philippines. I believe Aguinaldo himself, who was, one of the leaders of independence, was captured by the United States during this conflict, and the American Philippines lasted from, we'll say, 1901, or this actually says 1902, when the war ended, until 1906, when the United States gave the Philippines its independence. So that was the Philippines is more often cited as direct imperialism, right? And it's an example of American and direct imperialism. Hawaii is too, right? The Hawaiian government was gone, and the American government took over. In the Philippines, the American government took over. And so, with the acquisition of the Philippines, this was the most kind of explicit example of American imperialism. And so, a lot of criticism actually came with it. Some people questioned it, right? The question was, should the United States be an imperial nation? And there were a lot of kind of ways that one might question it. One was, did it contradict American values, right? Things like liberty, sovereignty, SOVERIGNTY, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Remember, the United States prides itself on being a government by the people for the people. Is the American Philippines a government by the people for the people? No. It's a government by the United States for the United States, but ruling over the Philippine people. So, is it acceptable for the United States to have an empire? Does it contradict the principles by which it was founded on? Well, Americans debated that. Americans debated this notion of civilizing mission. A civilizing mission is the idea that the United States was doing good and it could justify its acquisition of territories. We might say, did the U.S. either help or hurt the nations that they conquered? Um, those that advocated for imperialism would say that they were helping them, right? That's what the civilizing mission is, to um, bring those societies or civilization, or bring those people to civilization. That was a term that they used at the time. Other Americans said, was this just an extension of manifest destiny? Right? So much of the same things that we applied to spreading in the West, like resources and Christianity and all these other things, a lot of that stuff applied too, right? A lot of Americans considered Hawaii, the Philippines, that was just the next frontier. You know, in 1870, the frontier was Nevada. In 1890, the frontier was Cuba, right? It's just kind of moving the border or moving the frontier. And of course, another kind of point or justification about imperialism or kind of debate that they might have was the economics. And of course, it could provide kind of valuable resources. But what does imperialism do, for example, on the wages of laborers, labor wages? And you could even have some workers' unions that said, look, yeah, economically, maybe imperialism is good for like the robber barons, right? John Rockefeller can sell oil in China, or Andrew Carnegie can mine iron in Mexico. But by allowing for a lot more workers into the United States, maybe it's not always good economically, right? And there were certainly economic justifications that were used and arguments that were made against it. Now, those who came to oppose imperialism formed the Anti-Imperialist League, which was an organization that opposed imperialism. And, you know, they would have taken the various stances on some of these issues here, right? That is kind of some of the arguments that they could possibly make. And where we saw earlier with this image, this was a pro-imperialism cartoon. The depiction that we get down here is an anti-imperialism cartoon. So here we see Uncle Sam, who seems to be rather well fed with territory. And again, depending on how you can read it, it says Alaska, Florida, Texas. Essentially, these are all the territories that the United States had acquired at this time. And you have presumably doctors coming in hoping to describe anti expansionist policies, right? Kind of saying maybe the United States has become too greedy with their acquisitions seas. So at the end of the day, though, even though organizations like the Anti Imperialism League did organize, the United States pretty much maintained a presence overseas, and in cases like the Philippines, stayed there all the way until 1946. All right, moving on to section 4, Theodore Roosevelt and American imperialism. So perhaps no one more in United States history personifies imperialism more than Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt became the president of the United States following the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. So we'll say became president in 1901 and was in many ways, we'll call him the most visible and influential what proponent maybe yeah, proponent of American imperialism. Roosevelt was Mr. Imperialism, and we got a sense for some of his actions or behaviors in the Spanish American War, where he signed up front and center to lead troops onto battle. So when he became president, he was really able to execute kind of what his vision was for America overseas, and believing that the United States should exert its influence really all over the world required the United States have kind of the latest and greatest technology, especially as it pertained to the United States Navy. One of the things that Roosevelt was influenced by was a book written by Alfred Mahan called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this was a book which argued that powerful nations required what we'll call quote unquote blue water navies. And what a blue water navy is that it's a navy that can go far beyond one's borders. So it's not just a navy to protect your borders against any potential attackers, but it needs to be able to sail into the blue waters to exert influence overseas. And Mahan had used earlier historical examples. He had looked at, for example, the Dutch in the 1600s. They were one of the world's strongest powers. They also had the most strong and most powerful navy. They looked at the British during the 1700s. And his conclusion was, again, influence of sea power upon history was the nations that had the most powerful navies were the most powerful nations. And so Roosevelt, following that lead, decided as president that he would allow for the expansion of the United States Navy. And during Roosevelt's time period, we'll just say maybe like Roosevelt was in office between 1901 and 1908. We'll say the U.S. modernized, like getting the newest sort of technology, and built up its navy, becoming one of the strongest naval powers on the planet, right? And this was kind of a big deal in terms of the resurgence of, or not really resurgence, but this was a big deal in terms of America becoming one of the world's greatest military powers. It now had a navy that could compete with Britain, with Japan, with Germany, with some of these other countries. This navy was nicknamed the Great White Fleet, and Roosevelt often took the, not often, but Roosevelt would take this fleet and kind of parade it around the world as a show of force. So this was the U.S. Navy. That, say, paraded, paraded is a word, around the world as a show of force. And the fact that Roosevelt would parade this navy around the world to kind of tell everyone else, hey, look how powerful we are here in the United States, don't mess with us, that really was in line with what Roosevelt's policy was when it came to imperialism. And if you had to summarize Roosevelt's policy, it's this quote unquote big stick policy. Roosevelt would say, and this was kind of the phrase that was most commonly associated with him, called speak softly, but carry a big stick. And what he meant by that was when the United States intervenes around the world and deals with other nations, it should, quote unquote, speak softly. And that was like, be diplomatic, right? Be diplomatic, or, maybe be peaceful, to approach and engage with other nations kind of in a good faith way. Don't be, sort of rambunctious or flamboyant in this respect. But at the same time, always be prepared to fight and be prepared to let the country that you're negotiating with know that you have a weapon to fight with, right? A quote unquote big stick. So, one of the reasons why Roosevelt wanted to parade around the Great White Fleet was to show other countries, look, when we come to the negotiating table with you, you can choose to accept our terms or just be prepared. This is what you're going to have to deal with. So this was a policy. The big stick policy was a policy that was, in some sense, kind of diplomatic and peaceful, kind of at its core, but really required a powerful military to back it up, and that kind of shaped Roosevelt's perspective when it came to how to deal with other nations. Now, Roosevelt was mostly engaged during his presidency with imperialism in Latin America. He issued what was known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And essentially, the Roosevelt Corollary had built on an earlier declaration. This built on the earlier Monroe Doctrine. So, way back in the 1820s, the United States issued what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. This was 1823, I want to say this was. And what the Monroe Doctrine did and what the Roosevelt Corollary did were essentially the same thing. The only difference was here now in the early 1900s, the United States is powerful enough to actually enforce this. When the United States issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, you could say, maybe not to this extent, but they weren't taken seriously, or they were kind of laughed at when they issued this. And what the Roosevelt Corollary stated, or essentially what it did, was it said any European intervention in Latin America would be considered a threat to the U.S. It was essentially a proclamation that claimed that Latin America was kind of like our territory, even though the United States wouldn't take over Latin America directly and replace their governments. They certainly would involve themselves in Latin America indirectly, and they were making very clear to the other imperial nations of the world, to the Britons, to the Frances, to the Germany, saying, look, this is our backyard. We don't want you in here. And if you do come, Europeans, if you do come into Latin America, we are going to consider this a threat to ourselves. And so, with this sort of attitude that, Latin America is quote unquote like our backyard, there were various interventions that took place during Roosevelt's time in office, not to mention the ones that we already mentioned with examples like Mexico, for example. So, one example was Cuba. Recall that Cuba did become an independent nation, but the United States still exercised indirect control over it, including the ability to send troops, which they did in 1902. They intervened in Panama in 1903, and this essentially would pave the way for the Panama Canal, which canal is when was this thing built? 1916? A canal is a man-made river, and in Panama, the United States and other nations had long sought to build a man-made river that could cut across Central America. This would save a lot of time transporting stuff from the East Coast over to the West Coast. But many Latin American governments, namely the Colombian government, didn't want it. And essentially, what the United States did was the United States helped to fuel or fund an independence movement for Panama to break away from Colombia. And after Panama did that, or at least with US support, the trade off was that they would allow the United States to construct a canal, which they eventually did, some years later. Again, the Panama Canal, you could definitely say that, yeah, it served the interests of a lot of people, but it definitely also served American interests. And another example is when American troops intervened in the Dominican Republic. Right, Dominican Republic. So this sort of speak softly, carry a big stick. Interventions in Latin America, very much kind of characterize American imperialism, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Roosevelt himself, but mostly his successor, William Howard Taft, began to question maybe this kind of militaristic approach to imperialism. In fact, military interventions were often expensive. And some of the reasons why some nations were not, quote unquote, conquered was namely because it was too expensive. And so, one kind of alternate way of doing imperialism was through dollar diplomacy. This is a policy that we usually associate the most with uh, the successor of Roosevelt, and that is William Taft. Although Roosevelt and Wilson did engage in dollar diplomacy. And this was for the US to maybe control and influence with investments. All right, so rather than send in a bunch of troops to a country, send in American businesses, send in American dollars, you know, kind of gain economic control in some ways. And again, when we talk about imperialism, it's not just the examples of just openly taking over certain countries. That's part of it. But another part of it is exercising economic control. And when a lot of American investments pour into Latin America, they end up having a lot of influence over the local infrastructure, the local jobs. They end up having influence over local politicians, and so, in an indirect way, the United States can help kind of control some of these nations. One last thing that we'll mention about Roosevelt, and that is kind of the greater overall strategy as it pertains to imperialism. At the time, one of the most kind of significant imperial rivals for the United States was Japan. We might say Japan emerged uh, as a rival power to the US, specifically in the Pacific Ocean. And in, I want to say 1902, the Russians and the Japanese went to war with each other. This was a war in which Japan won. So, Japan as a threat grew even more. And as we make our way through the next couple of chapters, this ultimately culminates in the Second World War. But part of the conclusion of this war was that Roosevelt helped to negotiate the peace. Because definitely Japan expansion or Japanese expansion was becoming an American issue, you could say, or American concern. So Roosevelt helped to negotiate peace, and he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. Section 5, Women and Imperialism. So there are a number of different ways that women also participated and contributed to the greater imperial mission that the United States had. A couple of kind of roles that women fulfilled included being reps or advertisers for US businesses, so sort of on the business side. Also doing missionary work, so work with churches. It also included women working as teachers. And lastly, we can put the medical field, medical professionals. Now, one kind of role that women had in progressing the goal of American imperialism was to help define kind of these two terms that were frequently invoked during this era. And these two terms were savage and civilized. This is very much kind of in the ballpark of social Darwinism. Now, we talked about social Darwinism in an earlier chapter using the context of like rich versus poor. But social Darwinism was also used to describe the differences between civilizations or societies, differences between cultures, differences between races. And the idea was that under social Darwinism, there were simply some races of people or some civilizations that were more superior than the other, right? The most fit, as the social Darwinists would proclaim. So, what were kind of key defining features of a civilized society? Well, race would be one. And it was said at the time that it was the white races or European races of the world that were the most quote unquote civilized. It was also an industrial economy. So technology was an important part. And it was only the most fit societies that could invent or build the type of industrial equipment necessary to really embark on a quest of imperialism. And the last one had to do with gender and gender roles. And that is to say that amongst the civilized societies, men did certain work and women did certain work, and that was the ideal, right? That was kind of the best way of doing it. And so, women who inhabited the gender roles that were kind of prescribed during the era of imperialism and the Gilded Age helped to kind of spread that message in some ways. So, what did it mean to have a civilized gender role? Well, typically this meant that women were free from physical labor, and we might say retained sort of domestic, and maybe duties or responsibilities. Duties. And this was part of a larger cultural sentiment at the time, and that was this notion of separate spheres. Separate spheres was the belief that men and women ought to inhabit separate spheres in American society. And essentially, for women, it was the private sphere. So that is at home. That's sort of quote unquote the proper place. And for men, it was the public that they need to kind of go out into the world. And if women are in the private sphere and men are in the public sphere, then they complement one another in what they regarded as kind of the civilized way of sort of doing things. And so this image that we have here of what typically would be a middle class kind of stereotypical um, uh, kind of American woman at the time, you can see that she is having a hat on that looks like an American battleship, a key tool for American imperialism. It says world power on it. And she's even dressed up in kind of an American military uniform. But you also see that she kind of embodies the female ideal of, sort of the fashion of the day, right? So like a corset with a very small waist, a long, elaborate dress, kind of sophisticated makeup routine, right? These were all kind of the ways in which women were portrayed in popular culture. And so, one way that women could kind of directly maybe influence the spread of these ideas and the spread of imperialism was through quote unquote civilized consumption. That was the consumption of industrial goods, right? Kind of like an advertising campaign almost. And so everything that could and was produced in the factories, I mean, this ranged from, makeup to kind of like mass produced clothing. It could be ketchup, whatever it was. And there was a very close connection between the consumption of industrial goods and also civilization, right? So the idea was that not only were actual products being sold, but it was sort of selling a certain kind of way of thinking, right? And again, this kind of harkens back to this notion between the savage and the civilized. So in a lot of ways, we could say that women did help to perpetuate American imperialism, or at least uphold it, through kind of the various roles. that they might inhabit. But at the same time, there were also some examples of anti imperialist women. One such example is Jane Addams, the reformer who was in charge of the Hull House settlement house in Chicago, and also Ida B. Wells, who was the anti lynching advocate. And in fact, she compared the treatment of the Filipinos being equivalent to the treatment of African Americans in the United States. On to the last section, section 6, immigration. So there's a little section here in the chapter about the American Empire about immigration, although it's not always associated to imperialism. But as your textbook describes, it says essentially that imperialism and industrialism and immigration, I guess 3 I's, were all linked together. You might think of it in the sense of when the United States acquired territories, let's say the Philippines, it meant that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Filipino people would now be quote unquote inside the US. And so that might be the same as like a large number of people from the Philippines immigrating to the United States. And so a lot of the questions maybe around imperialism were the same questions that people had about immigration. So let us recall that after the American Civil War, that this period in immigration, we sometimes refer to these immigrants as the quote unquote new immigrants. And these are immigrants from 1865 till we'll say about 1920 actually. And they are new in the sense that they're coming from kind of different regions than immigrants had come from historically before. So we're talking mostly about places like Southern Europe. This would be places like Italy, for example. Also Eastern Europe. This would be places like Poland, Russia, and remember a lot of Jewish people or Jews also immigrating from Eastern Europe to the United States. And so the impact that uh, large scale immigration had was to create a backlash against it. In fact, in terms of just kind of giving a raw statistic, during the Gilded Age, or more specifically from 1870 to 1920, the number was 25 million immigrants that arrived to the U.S. So a very large number by percentage, the largest number at any time in American history. And so the backlash to immigration was called nativism. And nativism wasn't unique to this time period. Nativist sentiments emerged in the United States almost from the very beginning. But we can just kind of very simply describe nativism as opposition to immigration. And there were several reasons as to why people might oppose immigration. Specifically, large numbers of immigrants, and very specifically, immigrants coming from different kind of culture or ethnic backgrounds. So, for example, one of the major concerns among the nativists was the concern of assimilation. Assimilation. And some of this was motivated by notions of racial superiority, a concern that non-white people were migrating to the United States, and this might have, in their eyes, some sort of adverse effect. This cartoon here is kind of illustrating a little bit about that anti-immigrant sentiment. You see Uncle Sam here, who looks like he is, alarmed in the night, being awoken by this is the Irishman. What does this say? The Englishman, the German, the Russian, etc., etc., etc. It could be done for reasons to fear about the type of government the United States had. There was a question about would immigrants be willing to accept democracy, being that most arrived to the United States via or from undemocratic governments? Would they be familiar with American ideas? So this is also a type of assimilation, but not an assimilation of race, but an assimilation of ideas. There were concerns about the economics. What would immigrants, or what would the impact of immigration be on jobs? The answer was fewer jobs would be available. What impact would it have on wages? The answer was that wages would be suppressed, right? More workers available means that the price of labor goes down. So some people were nativists purely for economic reasons. And then there were also concerns about, or maybe fears of radicalism. And this would be sort of ideas like anarchism, ideas like communism, sort of outside ideas coming to the United States and potentially doing harm. This nativist sentiment is expressed by Ben Sanborn here. It says, quote, it also introduces, he's talking about immigration here, it also introduces disease, ignorance, crime, pauperism, which just means kind of like poverty, and idleness. The government must stop indiscriminate and unregulated immigration. So the idea was for the United States government to do something about that. And that's essentially exactly what you get at the end of the Gilded Age. And this is where the third wave of immigration stops, because it is it is the laws that are passed that restrict immigration that kind of bring an end to this quote unquote third wave. Some laws that are worth mentioning here, we've got three of them in terms of what we're going to just kind of provide as a couple of examples. The first one is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, as far as Chinese immigration goes, many Chinese immigrants were arriving on the west coast of the United States, so places like California. And even though they may not have arrived in the same number as people from Italy or Russia or Southern or Eastern Europe, Chinese immigrants were in some sense also new. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law that first limited the number, but later banned Chinese immigration to the US. Immigration. US. It is significant, and this ends up being kind of a, if you're thinking about kind of the broader history of immigration in the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act might be the most important immigration law, arguably. But the reason why it is because this was the first law to restrict immigrants based on, we will say, race. We'll say. We'll include ethnicity. Ethnicity/race. So before the Chinese Exclusion Act, the United States had never passed a law saying, look, this specific type of group of people cannot immigrate. In this case, it was the Chinese. They were the first ones to be excluded. They wouldn't be the last ones. There had been restrictions to immigration before the Chinese Exclusion Act, but again, it was never because you were from a certain country or belonged to a certain ethnicity or were a specific race. This was the first law to restrict immigration based off of ethnicity/race. Other laws, like the Immigration Act of 1882, also sought to limit immigration. Here, immigration was limited to those who were, we might say, poverty stricken or poor, those affected by mental illness. Who else? illness. And the last one is criminals. So these immigration restrictions were based on other things besides ethnic origin or racial background. We might also add that of the Immigration Act of 1882, other criteria were added later. So again, kind of addressing maybe some of the concerns that the nativists had. The last immigration law that we'll go ahead and mention here is the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. This restricted we'll say suspended Japanese workers to the US. So we have three examples here of specific laws that restrict immigration. Now, for the immigrants that arrived, we talked earlier about the ways in which they found life in America, and that was by really relying on ethnic communities and living in ethnic neighborhoods. That this idea of the melting pot, while it's true maybe to a certain extent, it wasn't really the experience of a lot of first generation immigrants or even second generation immigrants, and that the melting pot was not even though it's usually sort of touted and celebrated as kind of an accomplishment, we might say, for the ability for immigrants to assimilate in. The reality was, for many first generation, second generation, there was a lot of retention of cultural identity and heritage. And one of the groups that we could potentially look at was the status of Catholics in the United States. Catholics had grown from only accounting 1% to the largest immigrant group, largest immigrant religion. No. Grown from 1% to the largest minority religious group. What was the largest religious group in the United States? Well, that was Protestant Christianity. And the immigrant groups that, contributed significantly to the growth of the Catholics were, before the Civil War, the Irish, and after the Civil War were the Italians. So a lot of Catholics had come to the United States, not just after the Civil War, but even before the Civil War. And even within Catholic communities, and Catholics were maybe a little bit different than other immigrant groups in the sense that you did have a lot of linguistic kind of variety and cultural variety. I mean, later on from Latin America, also Catholics will come. So there wasn't any one uniform language or uniform culture when it came to Catholicism, or I should say, ethnicity. And there were kind of differences in the way that Catholics sought to maybe interact with the United States. And this was true of a lot of immigrant groups as well. And that was, do you assimilate or do you retain or hold on to kind of cultural practices? And within the broader Catholic religion, these two kind of positions were represented by kind of two different styles of practicing the religion. Those considered Americanists wanted to assimilate. That is, give up the way of life from the mother country and blend in to the way that kind of the predominant culture in the United States operates. But at the same time, there were also lots of ethnic parishes that were to not or maybe reject, written very neatly, and that was to reject assimilation. So as far as immigration goes, again, the Catholics are kind of a good example to show how not all immigrants kind of were on the same page when it came to this question about assimilation. Some wanted to assimilate and some did not.